Afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for attending this event. For anyone that doesn't know me, I'm Jason Jacobs. I'm the host of my Climate Journey pod, which has now, of course, evolved into this wonderful community. Very excited to have you today. Thank you for Eliza and for our esteemed panelists as well for making the time out of your busy days. And thanks to all of you as well for making the time out of your busy days to come and participate in this event. As many of you probably know, we're looking to do more of this kind of programming over time, stuff that we put on for the community, stuff that the community puts on for each other, and stuff that we put on with outside organizations. This one's kind of a hybrid because Eliza is technically an individual, but she has the horsepower of an organization. So we've done so with Eliza and a couple of other members of the MCJ community, Stuart and Parker as well. So thank you all for your hard work in making this event happen. And with that, I will turn it over to Eliza to kick things off.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. This is like such an awful time to live through, really. And, you know, it feels good to connect over solutions. So we're all looking for big levers to address the climate crisis. And elections are arguably the biggest lever. But politics are nuanced and personal and partisan, which can be an impediment to electoral engagement or getting political. So this panel is part one in a three-part series designed to reach a diverse climate concerned audience and really connect the dots between climate action and elections. In the MCJ spirit, this is an inquiry-based process and we all have kind of learner hats on. The MCJ community embraces diverse perspectives, but we're all motivated by the urgency of the climate crisis. So what we're doing here is saying, if the premise is that advancing climate action is the top priority, and we're all viewing the elections through like a climate lens, what is a range of electoral strategies that center advancing climate action, really across a spectrum of political ideologies? So today's panel will lay the foundation for the inquiry, and we'll have a conversation about the critical work climate C4s are doing to set the stage for new leadership that'll prioritize climate positive policy. We're gonna wrestle with what it means to be a climate candidate and what it looks like to support them. So I'm super excited. This is the stuff that gets me out of bed in the morning. So a quick glimpse into what's next. So part two in the series, informed by today's conversation, we're gonna set up a series of conversations directly with some climate candidates. And we'll talk about their commitment on climate and specific policy priorities and the dynamics of their race and kind of the significance of their race in the greater climate action landscape. And then part three, we'll hear from expert strategists about empowering ways to get productively engaged between now and election day to support climate candidates. So shout out to Parker Thomas and Stuart Powell. We all met through MCJ and we're working together to make this series happen. And thanks Jason for being open to bring this content to the community. So we're here for a deep dive into climate politics, and we only have an hour. So we'll touch on climate policy, which is of course the holy grail, but to stay focused, we're gonna talk a lot less about policy details and a lot more about the function of this particular election to get us closer to passing bold climate policy. So I'm thrilled to introduce our incredible expert panel. We have Tamara Toles, the North America Director of 350, Tiernan Sittenfeld, the Senior VP of Government Affairs for LCV, the League of Conservation Voters, and Kodiak Hill-Davis, the Director of Government Affairs at Niskanen. So they'll talk about the work that their organization is doing. They also represent a spectrum of ideologies, so they can give us broader insights into how different types of climate orgs are thinking about this election. Tamara can describe the strategies of the more progressive, or the most progressive climate C4 orgs, and then can kind of wear a broader hat and speak to the big green strategies, including not only LCV, but the NRDC Action Fund and EDF Action, Environment America. And Kodiak can give us insights into right of center electoral strategies that center climate. So first question here. We're gonna start with 501c4s. What is a climate C4? I personally stumbled into this work. I'm an earth scientist, and 3 years ago, I'd never heard of a C4. I did realize that we can't kind of science our way out of this problem, and it's a political problem. So I was trying to figure out how to get political. And then I learned that the NRDC, where I'm a longtime supporter, had this sister C4 org called NRDC Action Fund, whose mission was to build the political support to advance the goals of the NRDC. So I said, sign me up. And now I work with the NRDC Action Fund. It turns out that many environmental groups have C4s, and they're often smaller and lesser known, and I think a bit of a mystery. So let's start by shining a big spotlight on climate C4 work in general, and really climate C4 strategies, where the core mission is climate progress. Tamara, why don't you kick us off, and then let's hear from Tiernan and Kodiak, and paint a picture of climate C4 work and why it's critically important.
Sure. So back when I used to run a strictly C3 organization, I always thought of it as the stuff that gets your license pulled, right? So the difference between your C3 and C4 is that you can talk in general about what you'd like to see in government writ large in the C3 space, but when you start naming people, you have to move into a C4. Otherwise, you run into a lot of logistics and liability related to your license to operate. And given that 350's work is all about who gets the license to operate, that's a big distinction. So I'm here with our 350 action hat on for that reason. A climate C4 is focused on organizing at a different level and recognizing that the tactics we've applied of mobilizing and inspiration and organizing people across their different parts of the work to think about these issues as connected in the climate context has a different perspective, because for the first part of the last 10 years, we focused on just getting our agenda on the table. So the role of forming an action committee or a C4 is to say this is also has a political lens to it. And if we don't have action that institutionalizes what we've been yelling about in the street, we're just throwing parties.
Did I go ahead and jump in?
Yeah.
Great. Hi, I'm Tiernan Sittenfeld with the League of Conservation Voters. Thanks, Eliza and Jason, for doing this. Really glad to get to have this conversation with you guys and Tamara and Kodiak. And I think that Tamara captured it really well. So I will say for the League of Conservation Voters, in contrast with many environmental groups with whom we work closely, our C4 is actually bigger than our C3. We also have a political committee, LCV Victory Fund, and a political action committee, LCV Action Fund. And that is because, while on one hand, we absolutely want campaign finance reform, need to get big money out of politics, we also have to play by the system as it exists now. And that's critically important to be able to make the climate progress that I know everyone on this conversation is so focused on. So for LCV, we think that there's a lot of smart scientists like Eliza. The policy solutions are pretty clear. We do work to influence policy, but we feel like what's so important is to hold politicians accountable and to win elections. And that is how, again, that we're gonna make the progress on the issues that we so desperately care about. So we do that working with our 2 million members, with our 30 state partners. We're very focused on grassroots and community organizing programs around the country. But it's clear, and I think more so than ever, that the threats to our environment and to our democracy are so interlinked, and that, again, the biggest problems that we face require political solutions. We need to change who is in office. We need to only elect people who are absolutely going to champion them. And I think it's also never been more apparent that all of this is related, you know, whether it's the corona crisis, whether it's police violence, that the communities that are most affected, frontline communities, communities of color, absolutely need to be at the table from the get-go crafting these solutions. And that we, again, we do that by holding members of Congress accountable, by pushing them to really championing these policies. If they don't, we want to get rid of them. We want to make sure that members know this is how they're voting. So I'll wrap it up there because I know there's a lot to talk about.
So thank you so much to my co-panelists. You really laid a great framework for me. And I think I'm going to talk on behalf of Niskanen Center, but also just more broadly about what C4 work looks like on the right, because this is actually an area where the left and existing environmental organizations really have a distinct advantage to the right. While their C4 organizations do exist in the climate space on the right, they're just not as many, and the ecosystem isn't as fleshed out. And what I mean by the ecosystem is the structures that cultivate and support center-right GOP candidates who make the climate and climate action a priority. And it's without having a return on the right side of the aisle, if you don't have elected officials and candidates who are willing to talk about climate, who are willing to engage in climate action, willing to produce, endorse, support legislation that moves the ball down the field, you're really not having the same conversation. And that's hugely problematic. And while we have a lot of robust C4 work on the right, there's many that actually oppose any sort of climate action that we would all agree is so critically important. So I really think we have more work to do in building that ecosystem. And I know that is not encouraging looking at the 2020 election cycle, but without kind of building a more robust kind of infrastructure for climate candidates on the right, where we support them, we encourage them, we understand it's a progression for them. And it looks very different. A good climate candidate on the right looks different from a good climate candidate on the left. We really end up having this kind of stymied conversation where we're not quite doing as much as we could be. And all that is to say, C4 work is critically important. And as you pointed out, it's often, we all need more resources in that regard.
Yeah, so let's go there, because from my perspective, and again, I'm new to the nonprofit world, but it looks like nonprofits are kind of chronically underfunded, under-resourced. But if you compare C3 orgs to C4, I mean, the C4 orgs are looking really, really lean. It looks pretty lopsided. Why, and does that need to change? Like, I would just want to hear an honest assessment of C4 resources across the political spectrum. Kodiak, you already touched on a huge need on the right.
So, and I'm glad that you kicked this back to me, because I actually have a good example in mind. And I think it's about how you protect what I would call your climate friends on the right. So when you have members of Congress who are willing to take a stand on climate and introduce or champion action in climate, you need to be able to support them on the back end, because as I mentioned, without as much of a robust C4 infrastructure to support those candidates, make sure that they're getting through their primaries, that they're being reelected, you're basically losing your friends and supporters. And a really good example that's very personal to Niskanen Center is Carlos Curbelo, who introduced the Market Choice Act in 2018. He was on the Ways and Means Committee. He was kind of an up-and-comer in leadership, and just a really thoughtful member all around, really wanted to build thoughtful climate solutions. And he lost in the 2018 cycle. And that's a little tricky, because then you're losing one of your good, your champions. But also C4s on the left can't necessarily reach across the aisle and support him. He's not necessarily entirely within their mission. An endorsement doesn't necessarily help him with his GOP base. So you get into this kind of tricky space where if we don't have kind of the counterpoint C4s on the right being able to support those good members who are kind of trending in the right direction, we certainly can't rely only on the C4s that are traditionally more left-leaning. And then you get these tricky situations where we lost a really promising young leader in this space. And that there's nothing really to answer for that. We just have to do better at building that ecosystem.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Tiernan, can you jump in? So you said LCV is actually not lopsided in this way, but I mean, a lot of the big greens are. Let's hear your assessment kind of from Big Green Land.
Yeah, and I should be clear, that doesn't mean that we don't need more resources on the C4 side. We are just different because we do so much of the direct advocacy and do the elections. But I think what's clear is that for all of those who are fighting for climate action, for climate progress, we are up against an incredibly nefarious, well-organized, well-funded opposition who they really stand to have a lot at stake to defend their profits, to continue to pollute endlessly. So, whether it's the Koch brothers, whether it's the fossil fuel companies themselves, we're obviously never going to have that level of resources, but we need to have enough to be able to get our message out in an effective way. So for C3 organizations, Like my friends, I see Kevin Curtis on at NRDC Action Fund. Their C3 is bigger than their C4. I don't want to speak for Kevin. I think that's the same with Environmental Defense Action. Certainly we feel like there needs to be more of a focus on people who care deeply about environmental issues, and particularly the climate crisis, investing more in elections, whether that's through C4 organizations or political action committees or even super PACs. Again, we need to use all the tools that we possibly can. We have to throw everything that we can at this. I will say there are C3 organizations that do tremendous work, especially in the environmental justice space. Like one of the highlights for me of the last year and a half has been to get to partner with environmental justice leaders on the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, which people should definitely check out if you haven't gotten to see it. But there are leaders like Dr. Cecilia Martinez, who leads the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy, CEED, C-E-E-D. That's a C3 organization. So I definitely don't want to leave the impression that environmental justice or environmental C3s have the resources they need. Basically, we need all the resources we can get. I think part of the thing is that it's harder to raise C4 dollars because they're not tax deductible.
Right, I think that's an important point. Tamara, will you jump in and talk about whether C4s feel resourced?
Yeah,
resourced?
Sure, I can say on behalf of C4s, the answer is no. And it's because when you have to pick a side, people tend to shy away from that. So not only do you lose the tax advantages, but what you also do is dull the argument that you're making. And I think that it makes for a lot of good chatter to have representation that feels equal, even though as it was raised here, we didn't even have an environmental lobby till way late in the game relative to everyone else. So I think the reason why it's important to support C4s is because they have a sharper set of tools around what accountability looks like. It's a lot easier when you can measure whether or not someone is responding to you and then wait and push that into the public debate. As a left of left organization, let me tell you, we are super skeptical about what government can do, but there are no changes that we see on the horizon that don't happen if government is not taking the task. And so the best way to do that without starting all over again is recognizing that we weaponize our endorsements. We think about what kind of stands people take and memorialize that in pledges. We make sure that we analyze the policy plans that come out and then continue to raise those things throughout the electoral process, which includes the educational part that happens before someone mails in a ballot or pushes a lever or stands online to make their vote heard. There are a lot of debates that are won and lost well before that. And if you do not have a C4 organization, you have to weigh in with a duller instrument to do so. So it's just really important that we recognize that a C4 is only as good as the C3 that's attached to, because it can do that deeper dive work on why it matters. But if you want to get into the surgical work that it takes to move a politicized champion from being a fan of your issues at home over coffee to doing that in a room full of peers who will argue with them and fight with them, even if they believe it, because they have the numbers, you have to have a C4.
Okay, that's awesome, and a perfect lead into the next question. So those champions, the climate candidates, we know we need to elect climate champions. Let's go there. What makes a climate candidate? And let's hear you talk about it both in the relative sense and in the absolute sense. I think both are important. I'm really curious to hear how different your definitions will sound, or whether maybe there's more consensus than I think. And let's talk about a climate candidate qualitatively, but also the efforts to kind of quantify it, like various climate scorecards. Tiernan, why don't you get us started, because you're up so close to LCV scores, and then Tamara, and then Kodiak.
Sure, I love this question, and also curious to see how my friends answer it. So, as you noted, Eliza, at LCV we keep track of how candidates vote on environmental issues, climate, environmental health, public lands, democracy issues with our National Environmental Scorecard. And that's at scorecard.lcv.org. We actually digitized every vote that every member of Congress has ever taken over our 50-year history. So you can look at trends, you can see how the parties have sort of diverged over time. So definitely how members of Congress vote, and our state partners also have state level scorecards, I should note that. So that certainly people's scores is a key metric, something that we're really focused on. When people are running, we have a questionnaire with lots of different questions. We look for very strong answers. We meet with candidates we feel like that's an opportunity to educate them, not just to sort of hear about their priorities or talk about the race, but to talk about how they need to prioritize these issues. Because when we help people get elected, we don't want them to just show up and vote right or, you know, be reliable. We literally want them to wake up every single day. Of course, right now there's so many things to be upset about. And as you said, Eliza, so many concerns and so many priorities, but we really do still want them thinking, and in a very intersectional way, about racial justice, climate justice, clean, 100% clean communities that are good for our health in perpetuity. So we want people waking up thinking, what am I going to do about this today? And obviously right now, given that Trump is an absolute nightmare, that we have McConnell, who's almost as big of a nightmare, bigger in some ways. So we're not obviously legislating at the federal level. It's been really great having all these new champions who ran on clean energy in 2018, people who were state level environmental justice leaders, people who are clean energy advocates and entrepreneurs who are now in Congress and really prioritizing these issues. But clearly we're gonna need to have the trifecta to actually be legislating. Well, I think we'll come back to that later. But we expect people to, again, to vote right as sort of the bare minimum, but to also lead dear colleague letters to show these are the priority issues. For example, we must get clean energy tax credits included in the next recovery package because the clean energy industry lost more than 600,000 jobs during the pandemic just in March and April. So who's leading those dear colleague letters? Who's going to the floor to speak? Who's doing press conferences? Who's really active on social media? So I think really like showing this is a priority, this is my life's work, this is why I'm here and we're gonna make it happen. To us, that's some of how you make clear that you're a champion.
I'll follow up quickly by saying for 350 Action for sure, I mean, all we care about is ending fossil fuels. So everything else is a derivative of that from our space. That means we're looking for three things. How quickly are you willing to make the change? How quickly are you willing to make a stand that you're not going to support fossil fuel projects going forward, and show us the money? So are you going to avoid sending another penny towards the old way of working and systems that are dying, and instead invest that, double it, and potentially triple it by doing work that matters for a livable future? In terms of thinking through how we get to that, our climate test is really straightforward. Have you signed a pledge to stop coal, oil, and gas corporations from moving ahead? Are you going to do that as a person who's in the work? Have you publicly targeted this kind of activity as something that's really feeds an agenda that we're not for? And then we ask questions around how progressive are you in other spaces, because our work is about broadening the movement. So if climate people could do it alone, we would do it already, but not enough of them vote. Like a little more than a third of folks who care about climate actually have gone into the voting booth in previous years. Thanks to the compound crises or the syndemic that we're currently in, I think that's going to be less true this year, but in previous years, it's been very difficult to get people who are otherwise really educated into the booth. So sharpening our lens and saying, are you going to take stands we can count on, even if we are not standing in front of you, but are standing behind you? Are you going to show up to help us remove social license, and then building all the enabling legislation that it's going to take to move resources when we win from the folks who do not have it to the people who need it? So I think in terms of thinking through what a test or a scorecard or any other vehicle does, it helps to answer questions for those folks in your base who aren't quite sure how to make sense of all the different folks and their various statements and pitches and the punditry that goes along. So being able to stack them side by side and have a visual that helps people see where is this person you like on the things you care about, and present that to them. It's an accountability metrics for us, but it's also a memory for folks who are new in this space, and for left of less folks, it's tons of people who are new in this space. So it isn't about liking people, it's about knowing whether they're going to go the extra mile for them, and there's nothing like data to do that.
Great. Kodiak, let's hear it. Climate candidates.
So needless to say, well, maybe it isn't needless to say, maybe it really bears saying. Climate candidates and what makes a good climate candidate is going to differ greatly between the left and the right. I would say, I think I agree with both my co-panelists. They nailed it from their perspective. You really got to keep track of who's voting in the way that you want, who is taking an active stand and then backing it up. But the conversation on the right is obviously quite different. I mean, even just a candidate who's willing to talk about climate can feel like a good climate candidate when you have folks on my side of the aisle who are refusing to believe science, refusing to acknowledge that, you know, that anything has changed at all, and no, it's just fine. So I would also say that a good climate candidate on the left has to manage a coalition. You know, we just heard that there are a variety of different ideas that are kind of, and proposals that are active on the left. We really kind of have a vacuum on the right for that. So I would say that instead of kind of managing a coalition and finding a pathway forward, what we need on the right are disruptors and entrepreneurs. We need folks who are willing to deal with the facts on the ground, build coalitions, develop legislative proposals, even if they're smaller and more incremental, to kind of build the faction on the right where we could actually get some meaningful conversation and meaningful progress. Because otherwise we just kind of, we're not even part of the conversation. So a good candidate for us is willing to have that conversation, is scrappy, is willing to kind of go their own way, and then also start to build those internal coalitions. So I think they have to be a little entrepreneurial because they're not getting that kind of infrastructure of support that you may get on the other side of the aisle. So clearly a lot of space between the two, but I think as we can get more candidates like I described, we can actually get more progress and more meaningful bipartisan solutions. Because I also think it's important to note, and I think my co-panelists would agree with me, that it has to be any sort of legislative proposal, it has to have bipartisan support in order to be durable. And we've seen so much progress kind of be made in steps and then undone. And I think the way that I think of it, especially from the executive branch, when we kind of have these stalemates in Congress, you go to executive orders, which are great, and they set these kind of standards, and then they're so easily undone that you really can't, you take one step forward and 2 steps back, and it really doesn't allow us to make meaningful progress like we need to on climate. So again, we're looking for slightly different things in our candidates, but we are, I think, also still fighting for the same things. We understand that this is a big problem and it needs a solution. It has to be bipartisan, and we have a lot of work to do. On my side, we're not even having the kind of complex and thoughtful conversations that Tiernan and Tamara are having.
Thanks for that. Tiernan and Tamara, I'd love to give you guys a chance to respond to that if you want, and otherwise we'll move on to prioritizing different races.
I'd like to say that I think in terms of bringing in folks who are going to fight for you, like 350, we're rebels. We're old rebels and their kids. And then there are people who never had any kids and just found some kids on the way to a protest. So like when we're talking about, we have 4 generations of leaders in our movement trying to push for things they've been fighting for forever, battles that have been won and lost, people who have institutional memory about candidates coming and going, and people who don't care about any of that, who do not have assets, who not invested in the system, who don't feel like they have any reason to be bought in because all they have is debt. And so in order to be able to move through that kind of nuance, we need to have a mixture of those folks working on the inside game, not just the outside game. So I think the level of nuance is spot on. I think the idea that we need to be focused together on what a champion can do, will do, and what we can create the conditions for, that's the new information on the table, because so much of our work has been about creating a moment that allows people to choose to make an open choice. And every time we've done that, from climate strikes to from the first climate action we did in 2009, all of those things, the next thing that happened was someone on the right or the left saying, thanks for giving me cover to do this thing I always thought was right, but I would have had to do so much work to get this proposal even past committee. So you have given me a mandate that I can run with. I think we have to just be smart about our long-term strategy and connecting the outside game to the inside game and recognizing that we need all the tools to do it.
Tiernan, do you want to jump in, or should we move to?
We can go to the next question.
Okay, cool. So the next one I think we can keep kind of tight. I think it's important to stick in there, but I want to leave room for to talk about really the one after that, which is kind of endorsements. But this next question is prioritizing different races. A lot of things to vote for in November. A lot of climate concerned people are trying to figure out how to get oriented in this election cycle. Looking through the climate lens, is the Senate the most important this cycle? Is it the presidential House, state legislatures, gubernatorial races. Tamara, let's start with you. How do you think about prioritizing races this cycle at the different levels of government? And then Tiernan and Kodiak, would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I can deal with this pretty quickly. Look out your window. It's all up for grabs. We are no longer in a moment where we have to elect a president who can work with the Congress, because everybody has a vulnerable seat when the whole democracy is in question. So I would just flag that I think we need it's a trick question. And that we're not in a normal environment. Even the old information on polling that in 2016 would have no relevance to the moment that we're currently in. So recognizing that this many variables are moving through the system at once, we need folks who are here for the end to racial injustice that supports climate injustice, to defund and divest from institutions doing old work, and police that are beating people down in the streets and at protest sites for pipelines, infrastructure, fossil fuel, and otherwise. So I think we're in a moment where so much of the premises that we would have accepted in any other moment are not clearly defined, that we need governors who will not invest the people's money in infrastructure that lasts us 30 years but solves no problems, will not dig us deeper into transportation that doesn't take us anywhere, we need mayors who will fight for the right to use the police power to do the right things, and we need an executive that's going to move money through the federal government into states that are able to weaponize growth as a model for the future.
That's great.
So we need everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious because Elsie, I mean, you probably had a strategy going into the cycle, and now like pandemic and all this, like it does seem like things are a little up for grabs. I'd love to hear what you're thinking.
I mean, I would say, yes, it's truly all of it. So, I mean, yes, and to everything Tamara said, but we have to pull out all the stops, especially this year. You know, people say every cycle it's the most important. I think really this is absolutely the most important. So obviously, for starters, we have to get rid of Trump. We have to elect Joe Biden. If anyone didn't see the very strong climate and environmental justice plans that he put out last week, definitely check them out. But we're going to need to be using all the powers of the presidency starting on day one and every single day. But we also obviously need to defend the House. We're feeling pretty good about that. Certainly there are some individuals in tough races like Xochitl Torres-Small in New Mexico, or Debbie Mukersel-Powell in Florida, Joe Cunningham, who's leading on a big public lands bill that's going to be voted on Wednesday in South Carolina. We're feeling pretty good about the House, but again, particular people that need to be supported. You can do that at givegreen.com, which we're very grateful to Eliza for her leadership on that, but also our partnership with Next Gen America and NRDC Action Fund PAC to help these champions have the resources they need. But of course, we have to flip the Senate. So I'm just to make sure we need to pick up 4 seats to do that. We're really focused on states like Arizona, Colorado, Montana, Iowa, North Carolina, where there are incumbent senators who we absolutely need to beat. In most, if not all of those cases, the people running against them are big. They're both up and they're all champions who we're proud to support. Obviously, places like Kansas and Maine are really important as well. We need to defend Gary Peters in Michigan and in Alabama. So I'm sorry, Gary Peters in Michigan, Doug Jones in Alabama. There's some great House challengers. Again, not enough time to go through all of them. They are all on the Give Green website. I agree with Tamara said about the importance of governors. And I would say we really need to focus on defending Roy Cooper in North Carolina. Of course, in Washington State, Governor Inslee, huge climate champion who really ran his entire presidential on climate. So we think there are huge opportunities. There's also, you mentioned in your question, the state level. There are places where we hope to flip state legislative chambers. So with our state partners, we're focused on places like North Carolina, the Minnesota Senate, the Arizona House, the Michigan House. I'm happy to provide follow-up information on all of this, but I would say back to what Tamara said, like everything is up for grabs. The stakes have never been higher. So like this is the year to really go big.
Yeah, and Kodiak, I realize that to a certain extent you're taking the long view, and I totally appreciate that. But for the and you can talk about that for sure. But for the 2020 elections too, tell us where you're prioritizing, or how to prioritize, or how you're thinking about that.
Well, I think to take the long game is only because we have so much ground to make up on my side of the aisle. But in this election cycle, I would encourage participants who are listening. I think Tamara is absolutely right. I think Tiernan's absolutely right. I would say for my purposes, it's a national. The national elections are the game. it's the federal election. So unless you're in a state that is going to take action like California, New York, Texas, where they can really change, they're big enough and their economic drivers are big enough that they can really change the national conversation. I don't pay quite as much attention at the state level. I think if you want to get any of the kind of climate action proposals that have originated in the House through the Senate, you're going to have to flip the Senate. And it would probably be helpful to have a change in administration as well.
Okay, great. All right, let's pivot back to the candidates and talk about endorsements. It seems like there's a bunch of different strategies that go into endorsements. Can you all talk about what the endorsements mean for candidates? What goes into these calculations? Tiernan, you kind of touched on a questionnaire and how you prioritize candidates for endorsement. Also, I think this is really interesting. How do you use the endorsement process to cultivate climate champions on both sides of the aisle? And another thing I'd love to hear is like playing in the primaries versus the strategy behind sitting it out until the general election. Kodiak, let's start with you. I know Niskanen doesn't endorse candidates, but you can give us insights into how right of center orgs are thinking about this. And then Tamara, let's go to you.
Sure. Well, I'm glad that you also brought up primaries because just as a general point, if you're not weighing in primaries, you are not getting the candidates that you need to the general. I think it's a critically overlooked aspect of elections, and there are some reasons for that. But primaries are really important. It's really hard to defeat incumbents, but if you can get somebody through a primary, you can really shake things up. So as you mentioned, Niskanen doesn't endorse necessarily, but I think that the way that center-right C4s look at endorsing for climate, you have to be a little careful because as most of my remarks have indicated, climate and environmental issues are not necessarily big selling points on the right. So you always need to make sure that if you're issuing an endorsement, that it is going to help the candidate that you're trying to help and not cause harm. And I think to that end, a lot of the C4 work on the right has to do more with backing candidates who really support things like renewables and innovation and ways that we can use those things to spur the economy and to create jobs. So it's also like pretty clear on messaging. You have to be careful because we really have ceded a lot of the environmental and the climate conversation. And so especially in the primary before the general, you don't want to necessarily disadvantage a GOP candidate by tying them to something that could be used against them in the primary. And then once there's the general, your messaging can open up a little bit, but you have to be so thoughtful and careful about that on our side. And of course, we're working to change that, but that's long game.
I'll jump in here and say the 350 Action has endorsed a class of climate progressives who support a bunch of different things because we're in this endemic moment, from Green New Deal to Medicare for all to reparations for Black and Indigenous people to a pathway to citizenship and immigration. There's no chance that a climate candidate can also be good on these pieces. Our endorsements process really looks at that. From the questionnaire to how we score folks is really about, will you work for the broader movement? Are there places where you being an excellent person on climate, but really not being a fan of immigration causes real problems in terms of the bigger coalition of people who we need to move the movement forward? In our general elections, we've been supporting folks like Jamal Bowman and Marie Newman and Mike Siegel and Jabari Briesport and others, but what they all have had in common is that they're speaking for people who don't necessarily find a place for themselves in the political movement, who have left positions, even if that's as a part of a more nuanced progressive platform, and have been really thoughtful about what the future is going to look like, not yesterday's math on how we get there. So I think the endorsements are a fun place. We get sought out by people, like my own personal email, like random people. I'm like, this is not how our process works. Please refer to the website. So I think there are folks who we would love to hear from, and then we do. And then there are folks who seek us out because they know what comes with our brand is radicalness, is the idea that we're going to push for the thing we believe regardless of whether it's politically expedient. And so the people that we endorse that's what they want to be known for, is that the people are with them and that their relative popularity outside of climate space is a secondary aspect of their political interests. So I think some of it is alignment across your brand and letting people know what you stand for and what you're willing to fight against. So I think our endorsements process is fun. Can be surprising because we have a number of issues, and because as a movement we've moved not past talking about emissions, but including emissions in a larger conversation, which implicates the whole candidate and their whole sense of their views, which gives them an opportunity to tell a story through why they would want to be endorsed by us and what that means as they campaign.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Just to jump on some of what Tamara and Kodiak have said. I mean, I think for us too, many candidates seek our endorsement as like a green stamp of approval, and they feel that it demonstrates that they're going to be a leader on climate issues, on environmental justice issues, and also that they're running a credible campaign that can win. So when they come to us, we feel like we have an opportunity not just to hear from them or for them to ask for help, but for us to really drive home for them what our priorities are and to be clear that you can't just be think about environment as some niche issue over here, that these issues are all encompassing, that they're intersectional, that we need to be focused on things like Dreamers and DACA and ensuring that trade deals are good, not just for the environment, but for workers, and that we can't be confirming racist judges. So we do take the opportunity to educate them. We're also really focused on thinking about who are we endorsing and ensuring that Congress increasingly looks more like the rest of the country. So particularly focused on endorsing candidates of color, more women, more LGBTQ plus candidates. It was exciting to see the 2018 class move in the right direction, but clearly there's still so much more to do in that space. I will note for Kodiak, but for everyone, we were happy to be able to endorse one Republican this cycle, Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick from the Philadelphia area, who has led on things like protecting the Arctic refuge, on PFAS, on clean energy and climate solutions. We used to actually endorse a lot more Republicans, but I think it's really Trump and McConnell and again, the Koch brothers and other sort of nefarious influences have led too many of the Republicans into such an extreme position. And you can see the scores drop over time. You can see the statements that they make. It would be great to get back to the point where we're legislating on common sense climate solutions in a bipartisan way. So I do wish Kodiak success on that. And when we feel that there are more Republicans who are worthy of an LCV endorsement, we'll be happy to give it. I would say there is more success and more bipartisanship at the state level, like in South Carolina, where they overwhelmingly, through a Republican legislature, passed a really big solar bill. There are examples at the state and local level. It's just become so partisan, and unfortunately the Republican leadership in DC is so extreme. And then just a quick word on primaries. We have a pretty high bar when it comes to primaries, so we'll engage when there's a clear contrast. So for example, we endorsed climate justice champion Jessica Cisneros, who was running against Congressman Henry Cuellar, who's more of an oil and gas ally. She came close, she didn't quite prevail, but we felt like that was a really important race for us to be in. Or another example, Beth Oglio, who's running in Washington's 10th district, who has spent her life's work advocating for climate and clean energy. So yeah, I think that those are just a few thoughts to add on to what these guys said.
Well, that's great. And in this kind of spirit of collaboration, I guess, and Tamara, I'm gonna start with you on this one. I'd love to, can you guys give us a peek behind the curtain? Like how much do the different climate C4 groups work together? Like behind the scenes or even in front of the scenes? Recently, I feel like we've seen a lot of different climate groups coalescing on the policy front, right? With coalitions and shared platforms and agendas. What does it look like on the political front? And after the primary, do diverse climate groups kind of coalesce around the climate candidate if there's a clear contrast with the incumbent?
I'd have to say, over the last 20 years, I've had a lot of seats in climate movement. I moved every 3 years for 21 years through different orgs because that's how good at alignment I am. So in thinking that through, I'll say that it's been an evolutionary process. I think you're seeing more climate organizations work together because we recognize our strength, and we've seen that we have not succeeded when we've tried to push for a specific thing over our generalized platform and finding out where we work together. So I do think a lot of the work that we've been seeing in the forefront in the political race and what we're going to do in the executive and what the courts will look like and strategies for the first 100 days, those are all things that the left of left folks and the most conservative of us who care about this work have been doing together to recognize that getting over the hurdle of this group of things happening gives us room to live to another day, to have nuance. And so I think we're up against an extreme time and multiple versions of trouble. And so I think we're coordinating our efforts so that we can make the biggest impact. And at the end of the day, the question, I'm speaking as a Black woman in climate and the environment, that I've always had the choice of the lesser of two evils. So I'm welcoming all the other parts of our identity as a climate movement into that conversation around choosing to fight the battles that can wait later and to deal with the things that are most important now. So I think we are collaborating on policy. We're thinking through what are the least number of things we can agree to move forward. How can we be smart and use what we do differently? So 350, we used to be the kids on the block, and then our kids had kids. So now we're middle-aged at 10 years old. So we weren't thinking through what it would mean to neither be 142 years old or be exactly 3 weeks old. We would spend a lot more time trying to determine our space rather than taking what we know and moving that to support on both sides. So we can lean into our progressive friends who are 100 years old and get on TikTok with our friends who've been doing it for a week. And in that way, I think we're offering the largest number of options for tomorrow, where we get to fight about the other things.
That's great. And Tiernan, you referenced one of these kind of collaborative policy agendas. What does it look like in the political sphere from your perspective?
Yeah, I would say, we've long worked together in the policy space, and increasingly we work together in the political space. I mentioned, that we work very closely with NRDC Action Fund Pact and Next Gen America on Give Green. In the last election cycle, we together raised and contributed about $23 million for environmental champions up and down the ballot. We're on track to beat that. Definitely would welcome all of your support. Again, go to givegreen.com to find your favorite candidates and support them. We also work with the Center for American Progress and the Sierra Club and an awesome advisory board that includes Tamara on a campaign called Climate Power 2020 that is aggressively calling out Trump for being so horrific on climate change. There's a great website, lots of digital content, very focused on telling stories of people around the country. So would love for you all to help amplify that work. Maybe this is a subject for another conversation. We also work with NRDC Action Fund, with EDF Action, with the Sierra Club and National Wildlife Action on a program called Green Wave, where we're recruiting our members to volunteer for climate champions and climate candidates around the country. Typically, this would be a lot of knocking on doors, really fun. Also making phone calls. This year, it's gonna be, I think, entirely, or at least almost entirely virtual. So a lot of texting, writing letters, making phone calls. But definitely, I'd love to share information, or people can sign up. I can get you a link to sign up for that. That'll really kick into high gear like late summer, maybe right after Labor Day. But I would say more and more there are opportunities for us to team up, and we're so much more effective when we are working together. And I think our members really appreciate that and like to see it. So I feel confident that it's gonna, this will all build on itself.
Great. Okay. Feel free to paste links in the chat, and we can also do some follow-up with some resources. Kodiak, I'd love to hear about collaborations on the right, and then we're going to move to our lightning round, and then kick it back to Jason. So this has just been so interesting so far. So let's hear from your perspective, Kodiak.
So I think again, another distinction is that Tamara and Tiernan, when they're describing kind of the holistic platform that they have, there are a lot of value propositions. So there are a lot of different ways that kind of disparate organizations can come together and find commonality and then support either policy or then also politically. It's a little tougher on our side. In fact, most of you get like really positive collaboration from different organizations. For example, when we introduced the Market Choice Act, again, last summer, with Representative Fitzpatrick leading it, That was great. We had all sorts of organizations sign on and support it. But I would say that a lot of the collaborating on our side of the aisle in this cycle is probably going to be, unfortunately, negative. It's going to say, how do we minimize the downside of what's being proposed on the other side of the aisle? And that's because we haven't created space on our side of the aisle to have a more robust conversation and space for climate candidates. So we'll probably lean pretty significantly negative, and that'll be where most of the collaborating happens on this particular issue, unfortunately. And again, long game, trying to change it. Every step forward counts.
No, it's really edifying for me to hear you talk about it. All right, we're gonna do the lightning round, and let's see if we can move kind of fast through these. We'll go in order from Tamara to Tiernan to Kodiak, kind of along the spectrum here. Can you list 1 or 2 or 3, kind of up to you, key races for climate concerned folks to watch and get involved with this cycle if their main priority is advancing climate action?
Oh my God, move Mitch McConnell into retirement. I mean, there are a lot of things I could say if I had to pick one, but as a human being, I implore everyone to support the person who's running against him, who is not the most exciting person in the world, but let's deal with that later.
So hard to pick, but I'm going to go with Biden. We should not underestimate the current occupant of the White House, no matter what the polls are showing right now. And then 2 Senate candidates, Cal Cunningham in North Carolina and Teresa Greenfield in Iowa. Part of helping make sure that both that he's not the majority leader and that he's not in the Senate.
I would say because we need more good climate candidates on the right, maybe not perfect candidates, but Rosemary Becky is running in New Jersey 11, and she is one of the only NRCC young guns who actually was willing to talk about climate. And then I would also say, unfortunately, on the opposite side from Tiernan on this, but keeping Cory Gardner in the Senate is probably beneficial from our perspective for an overall GOP climate conversation.
All right, vote in person or vote by mail?
Vote by mail. I live in DC. We have a robust setup. It's great.
I was going to say, who has the opportunity to vote in person? As far as I know, we've discovered we have no new information on COVID. And I actually think the cool thing to mention here is that if you care about Black lives and you want to support climate justice, you should be for vote by mail, because not just because there's a history of voter intimidation, we are guaranteed to see some in this election. We're already seeing it in places as bulletproof on these issues as Wisconsin, and so I think if we're in a moment where people will risk their lives to vote, they shouldn't have to do so. So we're actually in a moment where voter protection, COVID crisis, and climate and racial justice really meet up in fighting for people's ability to cast a vote from their homes. And in the races that we've already seen it, there have been so much more responsiveness from folks who have not come out to vote in previous elections, even in the primary stage, because they can do so from their homes. So that was a trick question, and we're super excited to see more people get in on voting by mail, because you can do it without a stamp.
Yeah, I would say, I agree with all of that. LCB is extremely focused through some of our C3 nonpartisan work on voting rights, voter protection, voter participation, all in on vote by mail, but also vote. Every single vote counts. So however, as I see Cindy's question in the chat, however it's gonna work for you to vote, just make sure that you do it. And if you don't wait till the last minute unless you're explicitly planning to vote on election day.
Right, okay. I'm going to write 1 check, say hypothetically, and my top priority is influencing the election outcome to advance climate action. Should I send the check to a Climate C4 org or a PAC, an org working on voter protection, election security, directly to a climate candidate? Snappy answer, and then we can wrap it up. Or something else. Or where do I send my check?
I would say directly to a climate candidate of your choosing.
I think it depends on if they need if you want to do front of the house support, then you go directly to a candidate. If you want to do back of the house support and give them the means to prove their worth by validating them, then you might want to go with an action org or a C4, because what they do is provide independent validation. So the question is, where do you want your money to go? And 350 Action will take your money. Just in case anybody was concerned about that.
I would say, all of the above, they're all extremely important. Again, we're up against so much opposition. and certainly LCV Victory Fund, LCV Action Fund. We will happily take your money as well. Spread it around.
Okay, I am going to thank you guys, all the panelists, for your time and your tremendously important work, and hand it back to Jason and see if you have some questions that have come up, and then he'll make some closing remarks.
Yeah, and I have way too many to fit into the small time we have left. But first of all, just that was amazing. I learned so much, and to have these diverse perspectives, and you're all doing just such high caliber work, and you've been so transparent with us. So thank you so much. This was incredibly worthwhile. I mean, one thing that just kept kind of banging around in my head as I was listening to this talking is, well, it's a few questions, but all kind of related around the same issue, which is, I guess I'll start with, is it possible to be a climate candidate and not be never Trump?
No.
No.
Okay, Tiernan shaking her head. What about you, Kodiak?
I think that President Trump has demonstrated that he is not interested in any sort of climate action or taking the climate seriously. So I think you're right.
Unless he's running on a platform of turning himself into mulch.
But here, so if we follow up on that though, so all three of you now agree on both sides of the aisle that it's not possible to be a strong climate candidate if you're not never Trump. And given that, other than Mitt Romney, I don't know that I've seen anyone kind of go out, and I haven't been following nearly as closely as you guys, but it's like the overwhelming majority of Republicans are falling in party lines. And given that, that's not really a question, that's a statement. And so given that, all this talk about scorecards and nuance and issues, when aren't we just better off just like forgetting all of that and just voting blue?
Kodiak, that's a setup for you.
So just quickly, I think it speaks volumes that for LCV, we were able to endorse one congressional Republican, literally one. I'll send around our list of, like all the champions that we've endorsed on the other side. Again, I think it's really unfortunate. I think, and the polling clearly shows young Republicans care deeply about the climate crisis. It's literally their future on the line. So these elected officials in the Republican Party are actually doing this at their peril. And I think many of them are likely to lose because they are so bad on these issues. And we saw that in 2018. I think we'll see more of it, I hope, starting with the president.
I fully support. Go ahead, Kodiak. I fully support that, but I'll let you follow up.
I think you're absolutely right, Tiernan, and it's something that we talk a lot about, is that young people care about the climate, and there are young conservatives who are not seeing any value proposition right now in the GOP, and they are looking for a home. And if we don't get candidates who are willing to talk thoughtfully about climate and who are willing to demonstrate that they will take climate action, we are losing a voting demographic who otherwise would be very much in line with our party, maybe not in its current iteration, but its potential future iterations, because we don't have a value proposition for what they see as the biggest problem facing them in their lifetime. And I tend to agree. So we have, again, tons of work to do, but without that good value proposition, we are going to lose millennials, Gen Zers, just on climate, period.
Yeah.
And did someone have a follow-up?
Yeah, I was just going to say, fully support that. The question is not about partisanship at this point. It's about survival. People are voting out of a sense that they will not survive if the election does not go in the way that they hope it would go. So I think we're literally past the moment of politics. And, every one of these groups could change their name to something else. If their politics continue to vote against the future, then the future will not vote for them.
Well, that brings up a good point, which is that there's multiple issues that are happening in parallel, right? As each of you has mentioned, and we're all here because we're concerned about climate. But one question I have is, let's take someone who's a strong climate candidate on the score sheet, but in other ways, they're a complete disaster. How is that reflected in the score sheets, if at all?
At 350 with a question mark. So we have people who we support writ large, but there are question marks on their other issues. Where are they on immigration? Do they have any climate points that didn't come from 2009 when they were really great friends with everyone? Like these are the levels of nuance that make it important to look deeply at what a scorecard says about a person, because at the end of the day, getting to the same place while running over half of your partners is not going to be a workable strategy. And so while we're going towards the same place, this is what people care about. Also, this next generation of folks who use social media more than they use anything else, they already have the information. The places that like Gen X folks like myself, we had to move through an evolution of our thinking to get to a place where we would vote for people accepting what we don't. This new group of people, they're not about that. They have no reason to be bought into the system if the candidate isn't good on everything they care about. And they will read it, they will think about it, they will lobby that person in person and on the internet until it happens.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I mean, if we do a lot of research in addition to the questionnaire. So if someone is racist, homophobic, anti-choice, I mean, who we endorse is a reflection of our values. And if candidates don't share our values across the board, we shouldn't support them.
I know we're technically over on time. Do I have time for one more question or should we wrap it up, Eliza?
I think you can squeeze it in.
Okay. My last question, we'll see if I can articulate this in a succinct way, but there's kind of two different schools of thought. There's like, if we want to get big stuff done, ultimately, there's the like big national, wholesale mobilization, right? Where it's like, we try to lump everything in and like go for gold. And then there's the like, well, let's not spook everybody. Let's like, one foot in front of the other, just like keep putting wins on the board and grind it out. But the bigger we try to make this, the more politicized it gets and the less we're going to get done. I guess I don't know what the question there is just how should we think about that tension and how do you think about that tension?
I don't think there's so much of a tension. I think we got to go big and bold and be aspirational. The polling shows big solutions, whether it's the Green New Deal, whether it's massive investment in clean, green infrastructure, whether it's ambitious targets reductions, like getting to 100% clean energy in the electricity sector by 2035. That's all very popular. And I think—
On both sides of the aisle, Tiernan?
And maybe not the Green Deal specifically, but clean energy and climate action actually is popular, which is again sort of why it really is puzzling why some of these Republicans in office would be voting the way that they are. But I think clearly we are at such a low point in our country right now, between the pandemic, between all of this racism that's just like always been there, but it's at least finally getting the attention. So as we rebuild our economy, we have the chance to do it in a way that's going to address longstanding racial injustices, that is going to be more equitable, and that is going to truly transform our economy to be 100% clean once and for all. So even though what we're up against right now is so massive, I think the opportunity is also so big. And so like, let's paint that vision and people will be there.
I'm going to say incrementalism never, forward ever is the mantra of this next generation. In Bill McKibben's words, we are on a time test for climate. By the end of the climate decade, there are things we need to do, which means the political universe is anywhere between 3 and 5 years in order to seal in the things that will get us where we're going. So for folks who are woke and interested, like we are in a space where we are pushing for climate action that's super aggressive, wholesale reinvestment and investment in communities that have not been supported for jobs, infrastructure, and human health. And just so everyone knows, that's what the Green New Deal is. So you can't be for or against jobs, infrastructure, or human health, because all of those are things you weigh in on no matter what political affiliation you have. So I just want to flag that everybody's for a Green New Deal. So just looking at all of those pieces, it is not a time for us to build small wins and get them on the board, because the board is melting. It's also on fire. It's about to get carried away by a flood and potentially attacked by locusts by the time it gets to its destination. So we are not here for incrementalism. We want to see people putting real big ideas on the board. And for us, that looks like reparations. It looks like defunding the police. It looks like weaponizing your pension. It looks like divestment at every level and investments in the future. So happy to connect at another time with anyone who wants to chat about all that stuff. But climate people are just people who don't want to die.
So I would say something that I've often said when people find out that I'm a Republican who advocates for a carbon tax and weigh in on climate action, they're like, we didn't think you existed. And what I like to say is that we see the same problems, we just come at it from a different perspective for building the solution. But I do think climate is one of those big problems that does have so many different tentacles. Like, it's not just one thing, it leaches into everything, and big problems require big solutions, which is why the Niskanen Center backs a carbon tax as a market signal that we need to do something different.
I think that's a perfect note to end on, shall we? You want to wrap it, Jason?
Sure. Yeah, well, I'll say a quick thank you, but Eliza, why don't you wrap it? Because you worked so hard to put this together. But yeah, all of the panelists, you were each amazing. I'm so appreciative. Thank you for everybody else as well. But Eliza, why don't you officially close it out?
That's my wrap. I'm sorry we went over, but I kind of want this to last forever. This is it right here. This is the conversation, and just thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for bringing your wisdom to the MCJ community. I think helping people find ways to get political and make some sense out of the landscape of climate politics is just really, really helpful and impactful. So thanks for joining us and all of your wisdom, and Jason for hosting it.
Yeah,
And everyone for participating today.
It's hard to pick it up in Zoom, but so I don't know about everyone else in the audience, but I'm leaving fired up with a lot of new things to think about.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone.